In this lecture, we're going to talk a bit about the relationship between culture and creativity. Of course, you already know that creativity exists within a culture, but the relationships are perhaps a little bit more complicated than we might originally think. Some of you might be thinking, well, we already know what creativity is. It requires originality. It requires appropriateness. So why does the culture matter? There are a lot of reasons, but one way to think about it is to think about what constitutes originality and what constitutes appropriateness within a given culture. Do you recognize Ada Lovelace? Ada Lovelace was a brilliant mathematician, but at the time that she was working, she was within a culture where women weren't really thought to be mathematicians, and they certainly weren't people who should be patenting things. And so there were significant constraints put on the creativity that Ada could express within her culture. She is well known, but I suspect had she been a man at the time in that place, all of our schools would be teaching about her a lot. So appropriateness, perhaps we can think about how appropriateness might vary from culture to culture, but what about originality? Interestingly, I think there are some things to think about culturally there. The way we think about creativity as being rooted in individualism and in moving forward and in originality is rooted in 19th century Western culture. In fact, the word creativity was only used to refer to things in the arts up until the late 19th century and the Industrial Revolution, when it was introduced as a term that might refer to inventions or other kinds of scientific and technical accomplishments. In traditional cultures, this view of change as necessary and moving forward and in fact good, that idea is less prominent. And in fact, not all languages even have a word for creativity. Creativity as a commonly known word in English has its roots in the 19th century. The word créativité in French didn't show up until after World War II. And in fact, one review that I read of African languages said that of the 28 languages reviewed, only Arabic actually had a word that could be translated creativity. Interesting. The notion of the rugged individual is, think about you can see the cowboy out on the plain, or the hardy soul defying all odds to bring about progress. And in fact, progress and tradition are looked at as being diametrically opposed. Progress is a good thing. Traditional, maybe not so much. That's not the same in all cultures. That notion that each individual should push forward to do something new and accomplish something all by himself or herself, good heavens. That's a pretty American notion. These traditional cultures are, at their heart, concerned with preserving their traditional values. And so the kinds of innovation that are considered to be appropriate are going to vary. Either there'll be certain forms that won't vary at all, or the variety will be so subtle that someone outside the culture might not even recognize it. And that actually can be a real challenge in looking at, to say nothing of trying to judge, creativity outside our own culture. In fact, there are cultures where the notion of a lone creator is really a conflict with basic cultural values. There are cultures where subsuming the ego and not being the lone person out on his or her own path is a basic cultural norm. Confucian principles emphasize conformity and hierarchy and respect for authority. And cultures that are threatened may prioritize creativity within traditions because their highest priority is not losing their language, their art, their culture. It's interesting because within traditional culture, there can be some variation in where innovation is acceptable. In deeply rooted traditional and particularly religious values and rituals, any change or innovation could be offensive and not at all acceptable. Whereas in other aspects of the culture, whether they be theatrical or business or other kinds of art forms, in those forms, innovation and creativity may be completely acceptable. And before we start thinking, well, how quaint is that? I think if we think hard, it would be interesting to consider, are there parts of our own culture where changing them, perhaps critiquing them, perhaps poking a little fun at them, could be offensive to some people in some places? And in those areas, in those cultures or subcultures, creativity is less likely to occur because appropriate means don't mess with it. It's also the case that within many cultural norms, reinterpretation within a tradition is an important form of creativity. You can have a story that's been retold and retold and retold thousands of times, but the storyteller puts his or her own tweak on it, his or her own innovations, his or her own variety, and that's how the stories evolve across generations. Religious artifacts, generally speaking, are creative within traditions. And dance, theater, performance artworks can be the same choreography, the same script over and over, and yet there can be creativity there as well. Because my husband is in theater, I've seen a lot of theater over the years. And there are plays I have seen many, many times. I can certainly tell you that a really good director can bring to the script nuance and interpretation and insight that are not necessarily there in other performances. And in fact, I occasionally think that directors, if they are really good, can find ways to bring innovation to a script where even the writer didn't realize that the things could be found within their own words. Interesting thought, huh? Sometimes the tradition or transition of a culture itself can require creativity. There's an interesting example of a number of the Inuit people in northern Canada, where in the 50s, their traditional hunting grounds were being impinged upon, and it was becoming more and more difficult for them to live in traditional ways, and economically the communities were really floundering. Actually, largely in response to the enthusiastic reception of a particular anthropologist, they started to consider perhaps their traditional art forms might provide another source of income. And the carvings that were then exchanged with, they called them the people down south, the people in the more southern parts of Canada, became a new way to make a living. The transition of that culture, thinking about their ways of living in whole new ways, are pretty important. Another example was in one of the Mayan cultures in South America. I don't, off the top of my head, remember which one at this moment. But their weaving changed fairly dramatically in a relatively short period of time. And in looking back to see how that happened, people who analyzed such things realized that it happened at a time when the culture was in transition. And in particular, it was moving toward a more commerce-based economy. Many of the women were involved in commerce, and they weren't at home as many hours during the day as they might have been. Younger girls who were learning to weave were not as closely supervised, and as a result, they started weaving in new and more innovative ways because they weren't being told not to do it, I suspect. Weaving evolved in new ways because of the cultural transition that was going on. So cultural transitions can both require creativity and spark creativity. Interesting. So here's an interesting question. Is this a creative bear? Well, when anthropologists started talking to some of the carvers after the carving economy had been going for a while, some interesting things evolved. I recall an interview that one anthropologist did with a woman who's quite a prolific carver, and he was trying to interview her about where she got her ideas for carving and what kinds of things she did, and was a little perplexed because her analysis of the situation wasn't what you would typically expect from an artist. She said, well, I used to clean motel rooms, now I carve bears. As far as she was concerned, one was pretty much as good as another. They were both the way to make a living. So if she carved 10 bears and they were all identical, was that creativity? Maybe, maybe not. I will tell you, I've had a chance to look at enough of these Inuit carvings to realize some carvers are so innovative. Each sculpture is slightly different. They're beautiful. There's clearly a lot of thought that goes into them and a lot of creativity. There are other statues where you look and you can say, here's 20 of them. They all look exactly alike. They are basically mass-produced works of art. If I looked at just one of those, and I didn't see the other 20 identical ones, might I have thought that that was a particularly creative effort? I don't know. But it is an example of how sometimes people outside a culture aren't really able to tell creative from less creative things without understanding the context of the work that's being done. Another example here from one of my husband's theater magazines described Ugandan children. They called it theater of necessity. These were impoverished people who were trying to make some money out of tourists, and they did it by putting on theatrical productions. Now, I suspect that the tourists who watched the theatrical productions probably thought, oh, look at those wonderful creative children. In truth, what the children were doing is replicating very traditional forms, kind of as if our children were singing Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star or Wheels on the Bus. What was most innovative about this was figuring out how to sell it to people, realizing that tourists who came into that part of Africa would pay to see these things and changing their economy in innovative ways. Smart kids, right? Creativity can be constrained by politics. A classic example of that is during the Cultural Revolution in China, but we've had things like that in our own country. During the McCarthy era, think about what happened to actors and actresses and directors who were suspected of having communist leanings or having friends who had communist leanings. Sometimes culture keeps creativity from happening. On the flip side, creativity can be enhanced by multicultural experiences. There's actually research suggesting that the chance to embed oneself in a different culture can lead to enhanced creativity, and that even smaller creative experiences, many kinds of food, or working with people in multicultural groups where you're talking to people with different points of view, can lead to enhanced creativity. Makes sense to me because it forces me to think there's another way to do things, and that requires flexible thinking. Within the U.S., there are many different cultures, and when we think about our own response to cultures and creativity, it's important to think about the ways that our students are going to have different cultures within our own culture that might impact what's novel, what's appropriate, what's creative, and how creativity might best be expressed.